I've been asked on a couple of occasions to sort of lay out my design process from start to finish. How do I build one of these alt space worlds? And I've got a new project that I'm about to start up. It's a event space, so I'm expecting large audiences, presentation type stuff, place type stuff, and it's going to be patterned after the Acropolis Amphitheater. I'm not trying to do an accurate to scale recreation of the amphitheater as it is over in Athens, Greece. I'm just doing an amphitheater that happens to look an awful lot like the one at the Acropolis. And that's great because patterning something or recreating something virtually that exists in real life and trying to make it accurate to the point where I can say this is a virtual recreation of XYZ, blah, 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 blah. That's a lot more work than just designing something that's inspired by something that exists. So the basic requirements that I have for this from my stakeholder basically ruins at the front, definitely ruins at the front. They're going to put a web projector in the back. They're going to have a big screen up here, maybe mirrors all over the place. An area down here for an orchestra. I've seen pictures of the Acropolis where this is also incorporated into the stage. Probably a place we want to keep the audience out of, one way or the other. Definitely a narrow stage, stone steps, check. They want it at night, so it's got really cool. It looks good on videos, and the lighting will be really cool. I use Google Earth a lot of times for my references when I'm designing something that's at least inspired by reality. I can see that there's a lot of terrain around the space. There's trees all over the place. There's city nearby. There's urban area nearby. I'm not sure how much of that's going to be incorporated into this. We'll find out. But I can also see that the geometry of the space is relatively simple. Amphitheaters are really easy to lay out geometrically. This is going to be interesting. It'll probably go pretty quick. I don't see anything very complicated about any of this from a modeling perspective. I need to think about the area that's going to go into this, right? I like my world to look like they're in a complete world, right? I want you to be able to think that if you can get out of that space that you could just go forever. It's the illusion that I'm going for. So what surrounds this? What can a player see but not be able to get to? Those sorts of things. And then the primitives used to build this. I can see that my initial thought is that I would draw the steps in profile and then sweep them around a loft. That'd be really easy to do something like this. But there may be even something even easier than that. I'll see once I get into 3D Studio. I'll see. The player experience is something that I want to keep in my mind and forefront. What will they see when they first enter the world? When a player drops into a world, you should give them a hook, give them something that their first impression of the space should be something that draws them into the rest of the space. So where do the players spawn in? What's the first thing that they're going to see? The size of the audience and the world of weight kind of go hand in hand. Because if I'm expecting a lot of people to come into the space, I really don't want the space itself to be very heavy. I really don't want it very heavy if I expect it to fit within Alt Space's main event featured world sandbox, which is about 20 megabytes, more or less is my target. You can go above 20 if it's worth it, but 20 megabytes is about the target for everything. So I can't really go overboard with the geometry or textures, especially if this is going to be used for an event and you crowd 50 or 60 or so avatars into this world. Performance is going to take a hit. Looking again at Google Earth, which is a great reference, especially for a project like this, I can see that the amphitheater itself is a bit shy of 100 meters in diameter. And then this central stage / orchestra pit area is 30 meters in diameter. That's a nice big space. It'll be roomy and comfortable. If you've only got a half dozen avatars in here, it's almost going to feel too big, but it may actually feel small if it's filled to capacity. The height of this structure measured in Google Earth is 24 meters. I'll probably bump that up. I may leave it at 24 because that divides nicely. And there's 3 tiers. I can also see from this angle that indeed there are like other entrances, and there's probably rooms and stuff or passages that lead to the stage area from back here, from this backstage area. I don't know how much of a need there is for a backstage area for this, but we'll see. So as I mentioned earlier, I've got hills, I've got trees, there's all sorts of stuff around it, but it is going to be set at night. Nighttime scenes are much easier to give you that feeling of distance, of expanse than daytime settings. So nighttime will make it easier. I'm probably going to be putting a lot of thought into what's going into the skybox. Sometimes I do the skybox first. Sometimes I do the skybox last. It all depends on how the spirit moves me. I'm sort of thinking that the skybox for this is not going to be as important. Some of my worlds, the skybox does all the work. Some of my worlds, the skybox just is just sort of there. It all depends. And so now it's time to fire up 3D Studio and start working on some models. So I start this project off like a lot of other projects by just roughing in the geometry. In this case, I'm using a tube to the same scale as the footprint of the amphitheater. Pretty soon after this, I'm going to realize the tube isn't exactly what I'm looking for. So the approach that I'm taking is I'm using the tube as a reference, and I'm drawing a line that represents sort of the cross-section of the seating area. So I've got the slope there, and now I'm cutting in a little space for the walk path about halfway up the slope. And I'm going to loft that around a section of the circle. Now I'm modeling all of this stuff with 0, 0, 0 being the pivot point for everything. So it's the origin of the world. It's the pivot point for all of these objects. Everything that I mirror, everything that I create an array around, I use 0, 0, 0 for all of that because it simplifies a lot of that stuff. So I've cleaned up that line. Now what I'm doing is I'm assigning different materials to different faces of the shape, and I'm also using a face extrusion modeling method. So I've created this mesh by extruding that line sort of around that curve. And now by selecting individual faces, I'm extruding and beveling those faces. I'm also assigning materials as I go. Now the materials are just like material 1, material 2, material 3. I'm not bothering to decide what these materials are, with the exception of light emitting materials. A lot of times I'll decide here that I want to put like a strip light along a handrail. And it's easiest to just plug that light emitting material into this while I'm building out this geometry. Now this creates a very low polygon count. This entire thing is probably maybe less than 200 polygons. I'm not sure. I don't have an accurate count. I'm just sort of estimating. But it's very low weight in terms of geometry. So I'm going to let the materials do most of the detail work on a lot of this stuff. And now what I'm doing is I'm putting seating in. The thing about auditorium spaces is they really need seats. The problem with seats is that seats are very expensive from a processing rendering standpoint, especially if you use baked lighting. All of the surface area of the seats and the geometry and the shadows. So when I do an auditorium space, my seats are very minimalistic. A lot of times they don't have legs. The amphitheaters are great because the seats can just be sort of curved slabs that stick up out of the ground. I don't even have to put any sort of backs or anything on it because nobody's expecting it. The purpose of the seats in a lot of these worlds is really only to tell you that you're in an auditorium. If you go into any of my other theater spaces, well, most of them, the seats don't behave as seats. They don't have any colliders on them. You can just freely walk through them. But I found that people still organize themselves within the seats, but the only purpose that the seats are really serving is to tell you that there's a place here that you're supposed to stand, at least in alt space. And I'm taking the same approach here. These seats are going to be very light from a polygon count, and I'm taking the same approach with the seats that I did for the main foundation of the seating area, in that I've drawn a spline that is just a bunch of rectangles, and I did an array so they're all nice and evenly spaced out. And then I swept them around this, in 3D Studio, it's called a lathe modifier. If you're doing Blender, it's going to be something else. Everything's got this same sort of thing where I can draw a line and I can extrude it, or I can lathe it around a point, make it follow along a path. A lot of these modeling concepts are the same from one application to the next. So I'm doing the same thing to the top section. I couldn't just copy up the bottom section because they are a different shape because they're further away from the origin. So the radius of each one of those curves is going to be a little bit different. And also I want to do something different to the top section because I want it to appear as if there's twice as many sections in the top section as there is in the bottom section. So I create this block, and I move the origin of the block to 0, 0, 0 so that I can have it rotate along that same curve as the seats. And then I do a Boolean subtraction. Boolean subtractions, Boolean unions, Boolean operations. They're one of the main arrows in the modeling quiver that I use for alt space. The process for a lot of these things is the same. And a lot of times where I draw a line and extrude that line, and then based on the shape that I get from that extruded line, I do a subtraction or an addition of other shapes. That could be primitive shapes, or they could be other extruded lines. It's a very basic modeling process. You really don't have to learn very much of the software at all in order to get a handle on this stuff. Now I've taken the main foundation and the seats for this one section. I've put them together in a group so that when I get them over to Unity, they're all logically grouped together. I don't want to make one big object out of all this for purposes of baking the light map. So I create several smaller objects and then group them together. And, based on your modeling package, that could be called an assembly or whatever. In 3D Studio, they're called groups. Now I'm drawing a line that is going to represent that first sort of ruined wall right there by the edge of the seats, and hopefully will serve to block the players from being able to walk out of the auditorium. I'm drawing the line again. I'm actually going to draw this 3 times for all these different sections. If you look at the ruined section of wall from like an old church or a castle or something like that, you can see that the inside of the wall is made of a different material than the outside of the wall. Like it's a different type of brick, or maybe it's just filled with dirt or something like that. And so that's the effect that I'm going for, is sort of like a layer or sort of laminated look in each of these ruined walls. And to achieve that look, I draw the rough outline of the wall 3 different times, and I'm trying to make it look very irregular and disjointed and broken, because the different materials are going to break in different ways. And then I extrude those lines, and there's the shape of my first wall. Skipping ahead a little bit, I've done basically that same process to several different walls. I'm developing the backstage and the other side wall. And now I'm creating cutouts for the Boolean subtraction that I'm going to do. All of these walls have a variety of doors and windows and little holes cut in them. And I'm going to achieve that effect by, once again, just starting off with a line. Although I think this was a box and I chamfered two of the edges. But you can do it with a line too. Still very low polygon count. And I'm copying this around. And for this part, I'm intentionally being a little bit irregular with it. So I don't mirror the objects precisely, and I don't locate them precisely, and I'm not doing very accurate measurements or any measurements at all at this point, because at this point I've decided that I want there to be a contrast between the precision of the audience side and the backstage side or the backdrop side. So I like the very irregular sort of hand-drawn, smashed up a little bit look that you get with the backdrop side, whereas the space where the audience is, everything is precise and measured down to the exact degree, and everything's perfectly spaced out. I like that sort of contrast. I decided it's one of the things I was going to go for. So now I've done a Boolean subtraction through each one of these different wall sections, or it looks like I'm still doing Boolean subtractions through each of these different wall sections. Only the bottom row of that first wall is really going to be functional, I think. It's not like this space is going to be used for big productions where, actors are going to have to be coming in from different parts of the stage. I think it's pretty much going to be a presentation space for the large part. So only that bottom row of doors into that backstage area, I think, really need to be functional. Now I'm grouping all these things together and cutting in smaller detailed holes. So this is another reason why I wanted to do like 3 different layers for each of the wall section, because some of these holes are going to go all the way through all 3 layers. These blocks are only going to go through, say, 1 layer. I want to make them look like little alcoves. I've added some more wall sections to the side. That little cube in the middle there is the size of an avatar. So I'm sort of checking the scale of the overall mesh against the size of one of the avatars, sort of an sanity check. Although the thing about modeling like this is you really don't know how big something is or how big it feels, right? There's a difference between how big something is and how big something feels. You don't really know how that works until you get into a headset and take a look at it from the inside out. So I've got the stage modeled up. Here's sort of a player area now. I've jumped ahead a little bit, done some more modeling on the side, and I've done sort of a landing area for the players to move around in. And now I'm working on the terrain. Terrain in AltSpace can either be done as a Unity terrain, which that works just fine in most applications. But for this one, I decided to go with a simple mesh terrain that I would create here in 3D Studio. And it's not going to be lit by the baked lighting, so it's not going to be very heavy. The geometry is reasonable. And I think because it doesn't have to do the processing that Unity terrain would have to do, it's actually going to turn out to be more performant than this small piece of terrain would be if I did it as a Unity terrain entity. Terrain like that is really designed for bigger areas where you're allowed to explore and roam, and you want different levels of detail to pop in and out. We're not going to need this. The players aren't going to leave this little oasis here in the middle of these dunes. So now we get it over here to Unity, and we're in Unity now. And I've got some rubble pieces and some ruins that I did of a similar style. So this is something that I've done quite a lot in terms of doing ruins. It's a really quick and dirty way. If I don't need it to be like to scale accurate of some actual ruins, just doing it like this, some lines, copy those lines, do some Boolean subtractions, bada bing. Every different layer is a different texture, and it works out really well. Speaking of materials, I've got a few materials already made. And I've brought over some textures that I think I'd like to use a lot. This is a brand new project, and almost all of my worlds are individual projects, unless there's some degree of commonality between a group of worlds. They may take up one project, but if something has if a world is remotely unique, then I'm probably going to make it its own project. Here's a green marble. I wanted to put some marble in here, and the marble that I dragged out of my library was, well, it's tileable, but it's designed to look like tiles, and I didn't want this to look tiled. So open it up in Photoshop, do an offset filter, a clone stamp to erase the edges. Now it's seamlessly tileable. And then I figured I wanted a pink version of the same marble, so I inverted the colors and brought them both back in. And now I've got a nice green marble and a nice pink marble that should work very well for a lot of these surfaces. I've got a lot of light emitting textures all over the place. Well, I did have to go back to 3D Studio for one thing. So the steps around the edge of the amphitheater, the sort of lead up into the lip of the amphitheater, did not have UV coordinates attached to them. So I had to come back over here to 3D Studio, and I just put a simple box scheme that repeats the texture in all axes evenly throughout space. It's a great way if I want to do a lot of repeating textures, and I don't really want to worry about the UV coordinates so much. I'm not having to like map, say, a person's face to a model or something like that. I just have the UVs repeat throughout the entire space. Getting really close to work on the lighting here. Putting down a grass texture on that area. I've got some ruins scattered around that space. The person that I'm doing this for, I believe she likes to put signage and stuff around the area where the players come in. So I gave her plenty of area to do something like that. So there's setting up the direct light. A little trick I do is if there's a point of light in the skybox that's going to be the source of light for the direct light, I'll position the direct light between myself and that point in the skybox, and then rotate the light so that it's pointing directly back at me, and that'll make the lighting match up very naturally with the skybox. I forgot to set these little ruin pieces as being static, so they weren't brought into the baked lighting. The lighting this first pass is really intense. The direct light's too bright. My white light is too bright. Having glowing lights under the seats looks like it's going to be too intense. But the shading overall turned out really nice. I think I've got these currently it's set at 15 texels per unit on the light map. It is kind of big. Yeah, so I changed out the glow under the seats to yellow. I still don't like it. It's too much. Sort of washes out everything down there. This is the area where I think the players are going to be spawning in. Probably where I'll put the spawn points. On the whole, pretty happy with the materials. But this is an iterative process, right? It takes several iterations of looking at something and, making changes and going back. And we're going to see a few of those iterations here. So I've added these braziers that I used in another project with a fire particle system that I also used. I've used in a lot of projects. That particle system is all over my work. With a baked light sitting on top of it so that it looks like it's giving off a glow. And in areas where the brazier's by itself, it's shaded at the bottom. Started adding some colored lights to the backstage area, so sort of blue on the bottom, purple in the middle. Adding some spotlights off to the wings on the side, shining up on the main ruined wall. And you can see the little shaded alcoves. Those are just holes that are cut out in that first layer of rock. Dropped in some really light trees. These are trees that I modeled up myself in 3D Studio using their foliage library. So they don't have level of detail on them, but they're fairly light. I think this is pretty close to the finished product. Yeah, I've got reflection probes in. So the marble is hopefully, for the most part, reflecting what I want it to reflect depending on where you're standing. Got different sets of colored lights in the back. There we go. So now the next thing is to see what it looks like in alt space. Now, because this is a brand new project, I don't bother bringing in the alt space tools until I actually need the alt space tools. So I bring up the project manager, gonna add add the package from the tarball. Go get the tarball. I do like this. I do like this package manager. I'm not the package manager. This alt space uploader. Um, in general, I think I'm pretty happy with the update. I like the visual improvements. They're numerous and subtle. Creating a template. Get the template from my refresh the list, find the template, add the scene, build and upload, and then we'll see how big it turns out to be. Oh, one last thing I want to make sure is I've got at least something in there on the nav mesh layer so I can put my spawn points around. So my template uploaded, it was 15 megabytes, very nice. I can actually go back and add quite a bit of stuff in 5 megabytes of details. Check it out and see how it turned out. I spawned at the origin, so first thing I have to do is go put some spawn points where I want people coming in at. But this looks pretty good. So it's not entirely a contained space right now. Somebody could still get up on stage and walk out the back and go out onto the train, which, oh, the train doesn't look like it's lit properly. I'll have to fix that. So there's going to be some revisions. There's going to be some updates to this. But that, in a nutshell, was the design and build process for an Acropolis style amphitheater. I hope you found this useful or enjoyable, preferably both. And thanks for watching.